the type of dives that I would do now, I wouldn't have done like 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. Some of the problems that I might have today, which I can deal with comfortably without too much stress, might have killed me 20 years ago.
You're listening to renowned cave explorer Steve Bogaerts, and in this episode, we discuss cave exploration, the importance of training and progressively building comfort levels and experience, and then we investigate the Divesoft Liberty Sidemount Rebreather. All this and much more in this episode of Speaking Sidemount. You're listening to Speaking Sidemount, the podcast where we talk all things sidemount diving, from equipment, skills, techniques, and sidemount diving expeditions to interviews with some of the world's top sidemount divers. Whether you're new to sidemount, been sidemount diving for years, or just want to know more, this is the place for all things sidemount. I'm your host, Steve Davis. Let's get wet. Obviously, you're renowned as a cave explorer. You're still exploring now. You have projects that you're working on at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny because, over the last few years, I guess worldwide, a lot of people think of me more as like a sidemount diver, but sidemount kind of grew out of the cave exploration I was doing. So I've always thought of myself more as a cave diver, and sidemount is just a tool to allow me to do what I want to do. And I use sidemount because for me, it's the most effective tool. But if it was something else, I'd use something else. And for other dives, I might choose to dive in back mount, or I choose to use a closed circuit rebreather. So for me, sidemount is just a tool in the toolbox. And I'll take out whichever tool fits the particular environment and actually works best for the dive that I have in mind. So everything that I do is based very much on my exploration, and it has to work for that. And if it works in that type of environment, which is probably the most challenging type of diving environment there is, then it's going to work pretty well for most other environments and for most other people's needs. And so as I learn more, as I become a better diver, I evolve, hopefully, and my equipment configuration evolves, my equipment choices evolve, my skills and procedures evolve, the type of equipment I use tends to evolve. So it's never static. I think if you're standing still, actually you're not, you're going backwards. So you have to be very careful, never thinking, I know everything, there's nothing new to learn. I'm a student of diving. I will remain a student of diving as long as I'm still a diver. The more I learn, the more I realize there is still a huge amount out there left to learn. And that's what keeps it fresh and exciting and enjoyable for me.
Yeah, no, I understand that completely. Now, when we think about cave exploration, most divers shudder at the thought of passing a significant no-mount restriction and what that requires. And obviously there's a massive skill set, but I think more than that, there's a massive mental edge or mental requirements in doing that. Talk us through how you develop both the skills and the mental aptitude for passing major restrictions.
Yeah, I agree with you. Absolutely. Skills are important, but also the mindset is very important. Comfort levels are very important as well. And that's an evolving process. So as you become a better diver and you're doing more challenging dives, obviously you're basically getting better and you're getting more comfortable doing these type of dives. And the type of dives that I would do now, I wouldn't have done like 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. Some of the problems that I might have today, which I can deal with comfortably without too much stress, might have killed me 20 years ago. So because I wouldn't have been able to handle them on an emotional level, on a psychological level, because they would have been too far out of my comfort or experience zone at that time. So it's all about making progressive penetrations. And anyone who's done any type of cave training or cave diving will understand the idea of making progressive penetration. And that applies to everything that you do in diving, but particularly in overhead environment diving, which is that you need to build up your experience. And that takes time, and there's no substitute for real world experience, going out, doing the dives, and just gradually getting more and more experience and getting more and more comfortable in this environment. So I can still clearly remember things that when I did my early cave training and we were practicing sharing gas through a single file restriction, and I remember thinking, wow, this is pretty small. And now I look at those same areas and I'm like, yeah, it's not even really a restriction. So, your whole mindset will change over a period of time as you gain more comfort, more experience in the environment. Now, equipment is important, training is important, and if you get a solid foundation in that, it's going to speed up the learning process, and that's great. But unfortunately, what I see now is people trying to shortcut the experience part of it. Yeah. And there really is no shortcut for that. That's about going out and just getting the dives in between courses and building up your experience. And it takes time and it takes dives, and there are no shortcuts. Okay. I mean, I wish that when I started Sidemount diving, the courses I offer now were available then, because I would have become a much better Sidemount diver much sooner. The danger of that is maybe it gives me a false sense of confidence, or it gives me the idea that there are dives that I could go and do, or areas of the cave that I could get to where I don't really have, I might have the training, I might have the equipment, I might have the skills, but I do not have the experience. I do not have the comfort level probably to be diving there safely. And if something happens, who knows what the outcome is going to be.
Yeah. So how do you guard against that complacency on one hand and overconfidence on the other? I mean, you've done a lot of training, you've started to build experience, you're pushing some restrictions, especially if you get onto the exploration side, where I'm assuming you're pushing into restrictions where you don't really know where it's going to go. How do you judge when it's time to push forward versus when it's time to pull back?
Well, the way I describe it to people is whenever I'm diving, I have an angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other shoulder. Mm-hmm. And the angel's always giving me good advice, and that's the one I really want to listen to. And the devil is always trying to tempt me to do things that I know are silly or stupid or potentially dangerous, and I really don't want to listen to this guy. And every time I have, I've got myself into trouble. So the key is listening to that inner voice and making sure that you use a little bit of common sense and that you respect the limits of your training, but also the limits of your experience. And you expand those limits gradually. You don't try to run before you can walk. So, as much as an instructor might stress during a course, hey, take it slowly, build up your experience gradually, get some more dives and experience in between doing the next course and everything else. It really is up to the individual to make sure they temper what they're doing. The caves aren't going anywhere. The wrecks aren't going anywhere. So there's no point risking your life to make a dive. There's no wreck or cave that's worth dying for. So just take your time, okay? Build up to these dives gradually. It's part of the journey. To be honest, when you actually reach your goal, very often it feels great for that moment in time, but afterwards it's a bit of an anticlimax because it's like, okay, what's next? So enjoy the journey, take your time, enjoy the whole process. And then when you get to the goal, you think, I did it the proper way. It's a little bit like climbing Everest. You could train for that, you could gain experience, you could work, building up on smaller mountains until eventually you can get to the top of Everest, or you can pay a guide to drag your ass to the top of the mountain without really any input on your part whatsoever. And for me, one of those is the right way to do it, and the other way doesn't really count. That's not really an achievement. You're
definitely putting your life in someone else's hands, aren't you? So the idea of
risking your life, and you're risking the lives of other people. And we've seen that's actually resulted in some pretty sad fatalities over the years. And it's the same in all forms of diving, whether it's open water diving, technical diving, CCR diving, side mount diving, cave diving. There is a tendency for people to maybe rush a bit faster than they need to always want to move up to the next level as quickly as possible. And I always counsel people, take your time. This is an activity for life. It's not something that you need to do everything on your bucket list within the first year. Take your time. I've been diving now for 30 years. I've been cave diving for 25 years. So this just didn't happen overnight. I've been building up my experience over a very, very long period of time. And over that time, there have been various incidents that have happened that happily I had the experience and the comfort level to be able to deal with. But if I'd rushed too much, probably I wouldn't have had, and the outcome could have been very, very different.
Yeah, sure. And I think that the point is it's supposed to be fun, isn't it? So enjoy the journey, as you said, build dives between courses, 50 dives between courses isn't out of order, and enjoy each one of those dives for what it is.
Absolutely. And you know what? No one's handing out medals to the best cave diver or best whatever diver. Yeah. No one cares. So, I mean, who are you trying to prove something to?
Yeah.
So it's like, take your ego out of it a little bit, because honestly, no one cares how deep you dived or how far you got back in the cave. And the people who might be impressed by that are probably not the people you really want to impress anybody.
Sure.
So I'm far more impressed by someone who's taking their time and building up their experience and doing things methodically, calmly, consciously, not endangering themselves, not endangering other people. But maybe they have goals set and they want to do a certain dive, and they want to get to a certain place. Great, no problem. But there's a right way to do that. There's a wrong way to do that. And it's all about just obviously get good training, use the right equipment. But beyond that, it's all about experience. And I guess in the early days of diving, most people probably went through some type of mentorship, and that takes a long time. And then your mentor guides you in the right direction. Nowadays, the diving environment, divers have changed, and there's very few people doing that type of mentorship training. So people are taking courses, and I honestly think the training is better nowadays than it used to be. The equipment is better nowadays than it used to be. So it gets people to quite a high level very quickly, but then they need to actually go out and build that experience for themselves, because that's the part you definitely don't want to and can't shortcut.
Yeah, sage advice for sure. Steve, I know you've been working with Divesoft with the Liberty CCR or Rebreather in Sidemount, so I'm interested in, are you able to share some of your experience on looking at Sidemount CCR?
Sure. So I actually started diving CCR back in 95, 96 with one of the first commercially available units that was on the market at that time, which was the AP Valves Classic Inspiration. At the time I was living in the UK, and most of my diving was most of my personal diving was deep mixed gas wreck diving in fairly cold water. So it was the perfect equipment for that type of diving. And I subsequently moved to Mexico, and I've been living in Mexico full time since 98, 99. And most of the diving I was then doing was cave diving. So when I first got there, I had some deep caves that I was exploring, and the CCRs worked pretty well for that. But over the years, the exploration changed, and I was diving mostly shallow cave, fairly small cave. So open circuit side mount was a better choice of an equipment configuration. During the last few years, there are a number of projects that I currently have on the back burner I'm interested in doing. They're deeper caves, they're longer penetrations, and so CCR is the perfect tool for that job. At the same time, the caves have some restricted areas, so a side mount CCR is really the go-to piece of equipment. And because some of them, there are some logistical challenges getting to the dive sites, or actually once you're on site, it would be difficult to stage a lot of open circuit bailout into the cave system for various reasons, then it makes a lot of sense to have redundant side mount CCRs. So over the last 2 or 3 years, I've been looking at the side mount CCRs that have just started to come onto the market, because that's a fairly new thing. I mean, when I was exploring 18 years ago, there were no side mount CCRs on the market. So I had to take the back mount units I had at the time, which were the classic Inspirations, and reconfigure them to make them into side mount units. And they worked well, and they worked okay for project style dives, but it wasn't something you could really dive on a day-to-day basis. Whereas in the last 3 or 4 years, obviously a number of side mount units have come onto the market that are set up or designed for side mount CCR diving, and they are realistic to use on a day-to-day diving basis. So I've been test diving and doing courses on various units over the last few years, trying to find something that would suit me and the type of diving I do. And obviously I found the Liberty, and that was the best fit for me. Mm-hmm. And I've been diving that now for, I guess for the last 7 or 8 months. And I've racked up somewhere in the region of 60 cave dives on it now, and about just over 100 hours of time on the unit. And I really like the unit a lot. There isn't a single side mount CCR on the market at this point in time, which I think is the perfect unit. For me, the Liberty is the closest to what I consider to work for my type of diving, but there's still improvements that I think can be made in it. So, I'm giving the Divesoft guys quite a lot of feedback, and they're obviously happy to get that feedback, because I don't think there were too many people doing the type of dives I'm doing with the unit. So, the advantage for me is if they incorporate some of my ideas, I get a better unit to dive. The advantage for them is they get a better unit. So I'm working fairly closely with them. I'm not employed by them. I'm not paid by them. I'm not sponsored by them in any way, shape or form. As I said, all of the things I've done through diving with the Razor and everything else, it's all come out of my need for a particular piece of equipment to do the exploration I want to do. So I'm a cave explorer first and foremost. Everything else is secondary to that. If I can improve a piece of equipment or bring another piece of equipment to the market that makes life easier for other people or allows other people to actually do those type of dives as well, that's That's great. I'm in Europe at the moment. I'm going to be going to Prague at the end of the month to talk to them a little bit more about some of the modifications or changes they could possibly make to the unit to improve it further. And I'm excited about that. And that's fun to do, and it's really fun to work with people who are interested in improving their product and are open to feedback and constructive critique. And yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I saw a video the other week of you. Kind of wasn't the Yanni video repeated, but you were certainly in different orientations in the Liberty CCR. One thing that crossed my mind is worker breathing and how that felt. And I mean, you seem pretty relaxed. How did it feel?
So that's exactly the point. I want to be as comfortable and relaxed diving a side mount CCR as I am on open circuit side mount. Obviously, a CCR gives you advantages over open circuit, but there are some disadvantages as well. But the biggest thing for me is just to be comfortable while I'm diving. If I'm comfortable, if I'm relaxed, it makes my diving much, much easier. And then I can concentrate on actually what I'm trying to do, which for me most of the time is explore a new cave, to lay line and survey and everything else. Yeah. And so my goal is to get to the point where I am just as comfortable with a CCR as I am with open circuit side mount. And then I still have all the advantages of CCR on top of that as well. Am I there 100% at this point in time? Not quite, but let's say 95%. So there's probably a couple of things that I could do in open circuit that would be, more difficult or a little bit more challenging to do CCR, but not much. And so a big point you bring up is static lung loading, worker breathing, particularly as you change your orientation. And that was a big thing for me when I was testing the various side mount CCRs, was to find one that allowed me to move in different orientations, that allowed me to do removal and replacement of the unit comfortably, quickly, efficiently, without changing worker breathing, without changing static lung loading. And the Liberty does allow that. And so as you saw the video, it kind of was a little bit of a nod to the original sort of like Yanni skills video. And you can see that, yeah, I can dive the CCR in pretty much all orientations very comfortably, very easily. And although there is some minor change in worker breathing as you change your orientation in the water, it is still really easy and comfortable to use.
Yeah, I find it interesting. I've got a real interest in this at the moment personally, and part of it is that as I start to look at some of the deeper dives that I want to do, open water, this is deep wreck diving, as a side mount diver, and I'm purely trained technically as a side mount diver, not a back mount diver. Do I now go to a back mount CCR, or is there a side mount CCR that will work in that environment? So I get, and this is in terms of a question to you, is how do you feel the Liberty would transfer to a deep wreck dive open water?
I think very well. And I think you get to a point in your diving career as you evolve where just the sheer number of tanks that you need to take with you to do deeper dives or longer penetration dives becomes a disadvantage or a hazard in and of itself. And it just becomes uncomfortable to dive with so much equipment, because at the end of the day, we're there to enjoy the dive. We don't want to just become equipment wranglers and just have to deal with all of this stuff that's sort of like weighing us down. So it's funny, I got an email the other day, or actually a message the other day from someone saying to me, is there some kind of conspiracy going on at the moment? Like, how come all of a sudden everyone's interested in side mount CCRs and Israelis are doing something with Divesoft and everything else? And it's like, whoa, hold on. It's like, no, I'm not part of the Illuminati. There's no sort of like side mount CCR like conspiracy going on that I'm aware of. It's just a natural evolution. So for the people who are already experienced CCR divers or experienced side mount divers or experienced technical divers, it's a natural evolution for them at some point in their diving career to want to start looking at CCR. So if you come from a back mount route, then probably you're going to be looking at a back mount CCR. If you come from a side mount route, probably you're going to be looking at a side mount CCR. Now, if you're a back mount CCR diver and you're thinking about redundancy for longer, deeper dives, now rather than open circuit, maybe you're thinking about adding a side mount CCR as your bailout. Mm-hmm. If you are a cave diver and you were looking at extending penetration or doing deeper cave dives, then maybe you're looking at a CCR. Back mount may not be appropriate because the cave is too restricted, so now you're looking at a side mount CCR. If it's going to be a long or deep penetration, now maybe you're looking or starting to think about having some kind of double side mount CCR set up. And there's already a few people out there, people like Krzysztof Stanowski, who are already diving like side mount CCRs, double redundant side mount CCRs. I mean, I did it all the way back in 2000 for some of the exploration dives that I did in the pit. I was diving a double redundant Sidemount CCR. Obviously nowadays, with the much greater availability of Sidemount CCRs on the market, it becomes a very real option for people to make a choice. Do I want to be diving a backmount CCR or Sidemount CCR? Do I want to actually have open circuit bailout, or do I want to have another rebreather as bailout? And for a lot of dives, I would make the argument that it's fast, it's more efficient, and it's actually safer to have a bailout rebreather rather than all of this open circuit gas. And I think that applies no matter what the environment is. So whether it's a cave environment or a deep wreck diving environment, then I think the argument still stands that CCR, particularly Sidemount CCR, makes a lot of sense, particularly if there's any penetration involved. So my goal, and that was always my starting point, sort of like when I started thinking about CCRs again or starting to use them more, because I'd had a sort of like a little bit of a holiday away from CCR diving because the environment and private diving I was doing didn't really require it, but now I have some projects that do. It was always with the idea of diving double redundant Sidemount CCR because I'm in a cave. It is restricted passage. I'm a long way back. I'm quite deep. So it makes a lot more sense than having to schlep around a whole lot of open circuit bailout. It's a lot more efficient. It's probably safer. It gives me more time at depth if there is any kind of problem. So for me, it makes complete sense. And I think that if I look at how diving is evolving and I look to the future, I think that, to be honest, Sidemount CCR diving is probably the future of deep technical diving, whether it's in the open water or in the cave. And I think ultimately we're going to get to the point where people are routinely diving redundant Sidemount CCRs. Obviously the technology is going to improve, training is going to improve, equipment configuration is going to improve. And for those type of dives, that's probably going to be the way people are going. Now, again, is everyone going to dive that way? No, because it's like a fairly niche market. Not everyone wants to do those type of dives. So for the people who just want to swim around at 30 feet, on the reef looking at fish, they don't even need a CCR, let alone a Sidemount CCR. But again, it's just another tool in the toolbox. So I think depending on the type of dive you do, your experience level, then it becomes a very attractive option.
Yeah. I mean, it's a fantastic future we're looking at. And the fact that Sidemount, as you're saying, potentially can lead the way into the next generation of diving, I think is an amazing thing for us to look forward to. Steve, I don't have much more. I know I could go on for hours and hours. Is there anything in closing that you want to cover with the listeners?
No, just have fun, take your time, be safe. That's it, pretty much.
Mate, it's been a pleasure. Thanks very much. I hope we catch up in person sometime. I'll make it my mission to make it to Mexico sometime again soon. And I really appreciate your time, and I'm sure our listeners do too. Thanks very much.
Look forward to seeing you at some point in the future.
You've been listening to Speaking Sidemount from www.sidemountpros.com. If you like the podcast, please subscribe and consider leaving us a 5-star review. If there's something you'd like us to cover on the show, then let us know via our Facebook page listed in the podcast notes. Thanks again, and we look forward to you joining us on our next episode of Speaking Sidemount.